A mass assassination factory. That was the headline on an investigation by 972 magazine and Local Call into the Israeli military's artificial intelligence-based targeting system called Habsora, which means the gospel in English. According to the investigation, the system uses AI to produce targeting recommendations at a faster pace than a team of humans working alone would ever be able to do. Joining me to discuss this is Laura Nolan. She's a software engineer and a volunteer with the Stop Killer Robots Coalition. Laura, thanks so much for joining us on UpFront. Good to see you again. How does Habsora work? What kind of information would go into an AI-based military targeting system like this?
Well, unfortunately, what I can say is we don't know a huge amount for sure, and that's very typical for these kinds of military decision support or automation systems. I mean, there's just a lot of secrecy that's involved. I suspect that they're probably using several different kinds of inputs. So we know that there's an awful lot of surveillance that happens in Gaza. For example, almost certainly there will be communications metadata and intercepts. There will be very possibly human intelligence and also from CCTV and facial recognition and any other sort of visual imagery that they may have, which might include drone and satellite imagery. So potentially there's an awful lot of information going into that system from all sorts of sources.
When I hear about this stuff, for me as a layperson, this sounds overwhelming. This sounds like the most cutting edge technology possible. But the thing I was wondering is, are there even more sophisticated weaponry and weapon systems than that are on the horizon than just Habsora?
I don't think we know. So, for example, what I would say is Habsora is not necessarily a weapon system in itself. I think the mass assassination target factory was a pretty apposite term. So what it's doing is it's trying to identify targets which will then be struck with some other kind of weapon. It's very much a decision support system. But that doesn't mean to say there's not a lot of concerns around it. So one of the big talking points around this system is that the scale of it. It's producing hundreds of targets per day potentially, and we know that at least 15,000 targets have been struck so far in the conflict. So that's in the several hundreds per day. Human beings simply do not have the ability to go and to check in detail every one of those decisions that the system is making. And therefore, accountability is very much being handed over to this system, which, as you say, we know very little about. We don't know how it's been tested. We don't know how it's been validated. We don't know what criteria it's using to come up with these targets whatsoever. Although from the 972 investigation, the system seems to be geared towards prioritizing targets that are doing excess damage to civilian infrastructure and indeed potentially killing civilians. And of course, that's contrary to the laws of war, which state that when you make a strike, you have to be doing it for primarily military advantage, not to put pressure on a population.
The investigation cites a former intelligence officer saying a human will review the targeting recommendation before an attack. But this person also says the reviewer doesn't need to spend a lot of time on it. Are there enough human safeguards put into the decision-making structure here when it comes to an AI system like this?
It's a great question. And I think one of the big questions when you have to assess the risk around any AI system is to what extent are there safeguards around it in terms of humans in the loop and in terms of the overall riskiness of what's being done as a result of these decisions. I read the same article you did, the same investigation, and it absolutely points to insufficient human time and effort spent in reviewing these targets. And targeting particularly these kinds of dual-use targets, so people and civilian buildings, is extremely hard and time-intensive. So no, I don't think they are. From what I see, I don't think they are properly reviewing these targets, and they're very much leaving it in the hands of the automation system.
In a statement, the Israeli army claims that Habsora helps in, quote, causing great damage to the enemy and minimal damage to non-combatants. Now, the death toll in Gaza is now over 18,000. Many have made the case that advances in technology are designed to make warfare more precise, that if it's more precise, it'll be safer. Are you buying that argument?
No, absolutely. I'm not buying that argument. And this is something that you hear all the time, particularly from the more high-tech militaries. Typically, when militaries think that they have these accurate, these precise weapons, that they feel able to use them in built-up areas, in urban areas, in places with a lot of civilians and civilian infrastructure around. And unfortunately, no matter how well you hit the particular point you're trying to hit, and no matter how much what you're striking is a valid military target, when you're using high explosive weapons in an urban area with civilians around, you are going to do a lot of damage. So one of the side effects of more precision can actually can perversely be more civilian damage and civilian harm.
Wow. So what do you do if the more precision that you sort of design for, the more potential damage you have to civilian infrastructure, to people in these areas that you described, then what's the solution here from a technological perspective, from a design perspective?
There isn't a technological solution here. A political solution is what's required if you want to safeguard civilians in this situation. There is no technological solution for safeguarding civilians in war. More precision is not the answer to it.
You quit Google in protest over Project Maven, a contract for the U.S. Defense Department that would use AI to analyze drone footage. Maven doesn't sound much different than Habsora. Has what you were afraid of just become our reality?
Absolutely. Yeah, this is exactly what I was thinking about 5 or 6 years ago when I was at Google and when Maven was coming down the line. Once you have all of this data coming out of a system, people will want to crunch that data, draw conclusions from it, and act based on those conclusions, no matter how strained your chain of causality and indeed the legal basis for these decisions that you're making is. Maven was a surveillance machine, and it was analyzing people's movements, people's social networks, whole timelines of people's behavior and their pattern of lives. And this is almost certainly what Habsora is doing as well. Very, very similar technologies, very, very similar problems with them.
The European Union has just agreed on rules to govern the use of AI in the European market. But the Artificial Intelligence Act, as it's called, doesn't apply to defense applications or military applications. Did the EU miss an opportunity to properly regulate military AI? How do you do that? How do you regulate AI and warfare?
It's a very difficult question. Yes, the AI Act is not focused on military applications whatsoever. And, in reality, an EU Act is probably not the right venue to be thinking about the military applications of AI technology. The right venue is probably the United Nations or some kind of treaty process to come up with legally binding rules and instruments to regulate these things among all nations. How do you regulate it? Well, my belief is that we should not be using technology to generate targeting information, particularly when we come to the most sensitive and risky targets, which are people and dual use targets. And the reason for that is it's a difficult problem to decide whether an individual person or a dual use building or dual use vehicle is a valid military target or not. We do not have technology that is capable of even beginning to decide whether somebody is involved in combat or is a member of an armed group. These matters are not something that you can tell by a photo. These matters are not something that you can, tell by deciding if somebody has been swapping the SIM card in their phone. These things are difficult and sensitive decisions, and they require a lot of data and a lot of human judgment.
Human judgment.
So,
I just before we go, just that word human judgment keeps coming back to me. All this stuff comes down to human decision making, human judgments, whether we look at data or not, how we look at data. All these things are human judgments, and yet much of the public conversation is about the killer robots. It's about the AI technology. Should we be focusing more on humans and blaming humans rather than technology?
We should be focusing on holding humans accountable for what is done in warfare. And there are a lot of gaps and a lot of gray areas in international humanitarian law, the laws of war. But what is not a gray area is that when you make a military strike, your objective has to be primarily to obtain this military effect. Sometimes it is permissible under the laws of war for there to be collateral damage. But in this case, we have a very clear-cut legal problem, which is Israel is making strikes with the primary aim of harming civilian infrastructure and using the fact that there is that they believe that there is a military target present as a fake leaf for that. And I think that's something that people should be held accountable for. And absolutely that accountability cannot be transferred to any software system or any computer system.
Lara, Nolan, I want to thank you for joining us on UpFront. All right, that is our show. UpFront, we'll be back next week.